I have with me now, and they can't hear me, and now they can because we have a tradition of random people being muted at random times on this channel. Um, I have joining me now two amazing scientists, Dr. Morgan Rehnberg and Moiya McTier, who I keep trying to turn into a doctor, but she's not quite there
Soon.
yet.
I appreciate it though.
This is my confidence in you. I know you will
Oh,
finish. I'm just seeing into the future.
I like that. Yeah, it's gonna happen.
Well,
So welcome. And we've done a lot today so far about talking about the details of Mercury has a tail and the sun has this magnetosphere, and here's the details. But when we first fall in love with planets, we don't necessarily fall in love with their mineralogy. I, for one, came to astronomy via Battlestar Galactica, where the characters were named after the Greek gods, which got me to constellations that were named after the same Greek gods, that got me to science, which is where I stayed. It was the lore of space that got me to space. And the two of you look at our solar system from very different perspectives as storytellers. And I'd like you each to introduce yourselves. And then we're going to spend the next 47 minutes until we go back to Mines on the 49s talking about the lore of our solar system. Morgan, could you go ahead and start?
sure. So my name is Morgan Rehnberg, and I'm currently the chief scientist at the Fort Worth Museum of Science and History. I did my PhD work at the University of Colorado in astronomy and planetary science with a particular focus on the planet Saturn. And we'll be chatting tomorrow morning about all the lovely things that go around Saturn. And I never really grew up with this love of astronomy, love of planets, like a lot of people do. But I've come to it over time as I've looked at it from the scientific perspective, and then realized, how much more there is besides that to wonder at in the planets and the stars.
And Moya, what is your story?
Sure. I am currently a fifth year PhD student at Columbia. I study galactic habitability, which is the idea that there might be some place in the galaxy where habitable planets are most likely to form. Spoiler alert, it's probably not the center of the galaxy. The Milky Way bulge is not that friendly for at least life as we know it. But on the side, also not on the side, like equally important to my identity as a human being is that I'm a folklorist who specializes in fictional world building. So I teach workshops about world building. I'm teaching classes about facts-based world building. I host a podcast about world building called Exo Lore. And I am really just trying to teach people about how our world works so that they can use that knowledge and apply it to create new worlds, to tell new stories, or create new worlds to escape to when ours gets too hard. That's that's me.
And it's 2020. Let's face it, all of us have been escaping into fiction whenever we could because sometimes that's just needed. Um, Ambius writes in the chat, we are all essentially lore nerds.
Mm,
What was it, Moya, that pulled you into the lore and the world building side of things?
yeah. Mostly it was a fluke. I made very few like conscious decisions about my life before maybe senior year of college. So I uh, ended up studying both astrophysics and folklore in college because I found both of them separately and didn't want to give either of them up. And I went to Harvard for undergrad, where if you study two things, you have to write a thesis that sits at the intersection of your two fields. And the way I did that was by writing a science fiction novel set on a planet that I studied. So I had to do a crash course in fictional world building so that I could create really flesh out this world that I wanted to set my story on. And that was my first experience with fictional world building that I followed through on. I tried to write a lot of stories as a kid, but I think I stumbled into it without totally realizing why I was so passionate about it. It's only in the last year or so that I realized I'm so excited about this intersection between astronomy and folklore, because I think of folklore as humankind's first attempt at understanding the world around them. Mythology is the stories we tell. That's how we try to make sense of the natural world. And science is the same thing. It's how we try to make sense of the natural world, but we just have different facts, a different worldview now. So if myth was an early precursor to science and astronomy was the first science, I think there's just like a very beautiful connection between the two that I like to sit in as often as possible.
And and it's an amazing tool to draw people into the science of what we do. And Morgan, working at the museum and as one of our regular hosts on the weekly Space Hangout, you're interacting with the public on a consistent basis. And do you find that people come to you with these storytelling ideas as starting points in their discussion very often?
Yeah, absolutely. Of all the sciences, astronomy is the one that you never have to like trick people into wanting to learn about. And that's because it's something that is kind of at the corner of all of our minds. You said, Pamela, that it's 2020, we're all looking for a little escape.
Yeah.
And I think if you look back across the sort of the sweep of human history, you find that people are always looking for a little escape. And astronomy has so often been that. When you're running from a saber-toothed tiger, tens of thousands of years ago, and you need to take a load off at the end of the day, you'd look up at the stars. And today, when we're trying to forget the pandemic and forget the divisive politics and all of that, we escape into Battlestar Galactica and into Star Trek and into Star Wars, things that take our mind up and out from sort of the drudgery of every day. And so I think astronomy has always been lucky and fortunate to live at this sort of intersection of our imagination and what is sort of just within our grasp of understanding. And that's kind of a cool place to exist.
And it seems that this idea of it is through mythology, it is through storytelling that we initially began to understand our universe as humans. And today it is how we name, how we label the objects that we find, with stories being embedded in even the newest things identified on the surface of Pluto and Charon. And as you've studied this, Moiya, what are some of the most fascinating stories you found embedded in the stars?
Oh, fascinating stories. I am often struck by this Khoisan myth that I have heard. Khoisan people being from southern Africa,
Yeah.
South Africa, and
They're one of the
they
most
have,
ancient peoples on the planets. They have
yeah,
stories that go back further than any other tradition.
yeah, and they have this one really beautiful story of how the Milky Way itself was created. So we've always been able to see the band of the Milky Way across the sky, and it's visually striking. So we're going to tell stories about it. And one such story is that there is a young girl alone around a campfire late at night, and she needed to go home. Or in some stories, she's been kicked out of her home temporarily for making her mother angry. And so she's dancing around this campfire. She needs to get home, but there are no stars to light her way, because in the beginning, everything was totally dark and there weren't any stars in the sky. So she takes some embers from the fire and she throws them up into the sky to light her way. And then it has this beautiful consequence of not just lighting her path home, but lighting everyone else's path as they try to get home too. And that is one of my favorite myths about the stars. But there's just so much mythology wrapped up in space, and that's intentional. It was crafted. The IAU, the International Astronomical Union, that's in charge of naming space objects, has a convention of naming at least objects in the solar system after mythological creatures and figures. And so we have intentionally put stories, we've intentionally attached stories to stars. And I think it just adds to people wanting to learn about space.
One of the stories that makes me laugh hardest, and one of my silliest, most proud pieces of writing I've done, was about the moons of Jupiter, which are essentially Jupiter's wife and mistresses
Mm-hmm.
chasing one another round and round this world, which really seems like it would be Zeus's nightmare.
Yeah. Also, not all of them are mistresses, which I think is cool. Ganymede,
Yes.
uh, yeah, is after a male cupbearer of
And this,
Jupiter's.
this is something that we're perpetuating to today. Most of or many of Jupiter's moons were named decades or centuries ago. But when NASA put together the Juno mission to visit Jupiter, they named it they named it Juno, Jupiter's wife, because the spacecraft was there to go check up on Jupiter and all of his conquests. And so this isn't just something that was a fancy of ours hundreds of years ago. It's something that we're actively and continuing to invest into today. And I think that shows that this sort of attraction to telling stories with the inanimate objects that we put into the sky has just never left us.
Now, you studied Saturn, Morgan. What are some of the naming schemes from that world that was part of your life for so long?
Yeah, so the moons of Saturn are named after the Titans, which were, of course, the parents of the Greek gods. And so it's Titans, and then we've started to run out of Titan names, and so it's now also the descendants of the Titans. And then some of them are giants. So giants were descendants of Titans. So Enceladus is a great example of this. Enceladus is a one-eyed giant that we now know has a crack in it, leaking liquid water out into space. And so, if you found a new moon, you got to contribute to how we should name it. And then, as astronomy has gotten more and more in depth, we've kind of had this expanding complexity of the naming scheme. So let's stick with Enceladus, for example. We found these cracks on the southern pole where the plumes of liquid water are coming forth. And, sort of as we realized there were more and more of them, there kind of needed to be an ad hoc naming scheme for those. And so these tiger stripes, as they became known, were named after cities in the Middle East. And so you had the Baghdad and Damascus as names for these stripes for cities of the Levant. And that was just that's not really official. It's just we wanted to extend this idea of connecting things that we have here on Earth and ideas we have here on Earth with places out there in the universe.
Now, while things initially started named after the Western civilization gods that built so many of the ruins that society is considered to have been built upon, we have finally moved on from dead white guys to incorporate, well, different dead white guys as we move into the outer solar system and we start to get Oberon and his Hesperia. Um, with stars, we finally start to get names bridging additional cultures, and with Kuiper belt objects, we start to get, well, quite often fertility gods and creation gods from all over the world. What are your favorite ways that we've brought additional cultures into the sky? I'm going to go to Moiya first on this one.
Well, that's a great question. I honestly don't know of many examples because my research keeps me far away from the solar system. So
Yes.
the only example that's coming to my mind right now is Oumuamua, the comet, I guess, or asteroid.
Yes, extrasolar
Yeah,
comet.
yeah. We can trace its orbit, we can trace its path and try to figure out where it came from. But its name, Oumuamua, comes from the Hawaiian word for And what does it mean? See, this is how little I know about it. I know that it comes from Hawaii, but I don't know what it means. Do either of you know?
That was going to be my example too, and now you're making me question it. I thought it had to do with like a Voyager, and the
Okay.
idea that a lot of these objects, Kuiper Belt objects, extrasolar objects that we're starting to discover are on these long voyages, and so we're
Mhm.
naming them after uh, people and ideas from the Polynesian cultures because they undertook these tremendous voyages
Mhm.
across the Pacific Ocean, guided by the stars. And
Yeah.
so I think, in a sense, we have an opportunity now to not only broaden what we mean when we pick a name, but also to match those names up even better. Because once we've opened ourselves up to the Kuiper Belt and to stars and to the universe, there's so many more different kinds of things out there. And there's so much diversity in the kinds of things and the kinds of peoples here on Earth that we can make those names even more meaningful by
Mhm.
matching them up even more closely. There's nothing particularly, you know, Jupiter related about the Greek, about Jupiter and the Greek and Zeus and the Greek gods. But, the idea that a Voyager is connected to the great Voyagers here on Earth, I think is
Mhm.
just kind of a romantic idea that lends it that extra little bit of meaning.
Yeah. Also, I think Oumuamua was partially discovered by Hawaiian telescopes, and part of the naming conventions for different objects in space is that the people who discover it get to at least have some input for what the name ultimately is. And since these days we're getting more telescopes are in these really remote, beautiful parts of the world. These days, we're trying to make more of an effort to include native populations in the science that we're doing on their land. And so when you get people from different cultures involved in the science so that they can make the discoveries, so that they can name the things after culturally relevant stories, then that's how we end up with more diverse stories signed to objects in space.
And the possibilities are literally endless as we look to how many stars are out there. And you're out there working on newly found worlds and dreaming of what is possible. What goes into world building as you do it?
Yes, I love this question. I love talking to people about world building. So every world builder has their own process. Mine is called facts-based world building. I like to use facts from different academic disciplines, not just the sciences. I also use a lot of history knowledge, a lot of sociology and archaeology knowledge. But I like to think that when I use facts, I don't have to do as much work because I don't have to make a lot of stuff up. It's already there. I just have to find the information and know how to use it and apply it to new worlds. But the way I world build is that I always answer a series of questions in the same order. So my questions are, what makes this world different? There are so many different things that you can choose. Then how did the world get that way? Sometimes you want to answer that question for your story, sometimes you don't. So it just depends on your preference. And then after those two, I go through environment, biology, and then culture in that order, because environment feeds into biology, because what our bodies do depend on what environment we live in. And then biology feeds into culture because what we need to survive will determine what we believe, what we do, what rituals we have. And so those are the five questions that I use for facts-based world building.
And so, with that kind of a way of viewing a society's influence from what it sees, a society that lives in a triple star system with that one nearby star and maybe that distant binary off in the distance,
Mm-hmm.
that would have a different culture to this population of a little red dwarf all by its lonesome.
Oh, absolutely.
What are some of the things that you've imagined based off of facts that could come into the thinking of a non-terrestrial society?
On-terrestrial society. I mean, so many. Earlier this year, I imagined a world for my podcast that didn't orbit a star, as there are, hundreds of billions, we think, of rogue planets out there. So these are planets that don't orbit host stars, but
Yeah.
they are kind of just free floating through the galaxy. We can't see them because they aren't emitting their own light, and they're not blocking any other star's light. So we can't use the transit method to
Uh-huh.
find them. But because this planet didn't orbit a star, there wasn't any source of light. So even though the default assumption is that life does originate on these planets that I build, but they don't have light. So why would they develop the sense of vision? And
Yeah.
so it was really interesting to see an entire world built by and for people who don't see. So you get a lot of things like tactile messaging, and instead of writing as a form of transporting knowledge from one generation to the next, we imagined that there would be these beautiful sonic systems that can encode language, or that engraving and embossing would be more common, that it would be a very maybe touchy community, or that smells would be more important, and the sound of a person's voice would be more important if you can't see them. And so just those are just tiny ways that culture and biology are influenced by something like not being around a star.
Now, please tell me you've seen the TV show See.
I haven't, but
Ah!
I don't have the Apple streaming service.
Okay.
But I is it good?
It's it spends so much time world building that some people complain there isn't enough plot in the first season. But
Fair.
I also think you might enjoy some of the extra time that went into the world building. And we're getting a second season to see how they plot build in the second season.
Okay.
Um,
Good.
so Morgan, being in a museum, you're in a special place to try and figure out how to communicate our universe to diverse audiences. And we do suffer from a habit of telling the stories of only one set of societies. But there's a myriad of different stories about our own sky out there. What do you do to try and bring all these stories together?
Well, one thing I think you can do is to start not with the stories, but with people's curiosity. And again, this is a place that astronomy is so fortunate and so privileged over trying to engage people in other areas of science, because you can start with your curiosity and then build your own stories from there. And while we very much have privileged certain stories in the past, everybody's curiosity is equal, and so everybody's path from that curiosity to a new idea is equal as well. And so back when we could do things like have planetarium shows, we would include the stories of many different cultures, but we would also invite often our youngest guests to look up into the sky and make their own pictures. And I think this hits on something that sort of is the realization of these world building ideas, which is we do live here on planet Earth, and that has so remarkably shaped the way our societies have evolved, the way our culture is. And if you look across the whole world, you look at the early peoples from Europe and from Africa and from Asia and the Americas, and there are very, very, very few things that they all have in common. They didn't all develop writing systems. They didn't all develop large cities or build megalithic structures. But something that every single one of them did was look up and tell stories about the sky. And so this is something that has united people since people were people.
Yeah.
And so being part of that, telling your own stories from the sky, makes you part of that narrative. And your story is just as valid as the story that you might hear about why Orion the Hunter is up in the sky, or about the two lovers separated by the Milky Way from Chinese mythology. None of those stories are right in some sort of scientific sense. And so why not have fun exploring what they can mean beyond the science?
Now, before we go on to my next question, which is going to be what universal stories seem to crop up a lot in how we see the night. Before we do that, I want to do a quick station identification for those of you out there watching. This is the CosmoQuest Hangoutathon 2020. I'm your host, Dr. Pamela Gay, and this hour we are talking about world lore. This is, oh my goodness, we are in hour 6 of 36 hours of streaming right here on twitch.tv/CosmoQuestX and Now Media Radio, available not just through the airwaves, but also on Apple TV and Roku. We are here to raise money to keep the science flowing. It takes money to communicate science out to the public and to engage people in helping to map other worlds. Our community spent the summer of 2019 mapping Bennu, and just earlier this week we saw that little spacecraft dive down and grab more sample than any of us anticipated. We're going to have Karina Bennett on to talk about that later during this stream. It takes money to do what we do. And we are hoping that as we sit here singing for our supper, those of you who are doing okay in these pandemic times, and we know a lot of you aren't, those of you who are doing okay, we're hoping that you will consider making a donation to keep all of our programs coming through the coming year. I am really enjoying all of the comments about Bennu. Our population marked over 14 million marks on maps of the surface, identifying rocks, boulders, and craters to help identify potentially safe and scientific landing sites. And we did it in 91 days. We're all a little burnt out on the rocks. A little burnt out on the rocks. I love the expression that I'm seeing in our guests in reaction to that. Not all science is pretty. Some of it involves a lot of rocks. A lot of rocks.
Support the rocks. The work that CosmoQuest does is so important, and it would just be awesome to be able to let them keep going. And who knows, we can jam up some more spacecraft in the near future if you just make it possible.
These are our goals. These are our goals. And we do everything we can to take good care of our staff. Even our part-time staff have benefits offered if they need them. Yeah, it's you have to provide. You have to provide for the people you care for. So, as we continue, certain themes seem to crop up over and over, culture to culture. What are some of the themes that have spoken to you over the years? And I'm going to go to you first this time, Morgan.
I think there's a lot of the idea of loss and separation. I think we've all looked up into the stars and seen how close together they appear, and yet we've intuited how far apart they really are and how far they are from us. And so you look and you see stories across culture after culture of long lost lovers getting reunited in the stars, or gods throwing people into the sky to keep them apart from the trouble that they're creating on Earth. And so I think long before we had any practical understanding of the vastness of the universe, we intuited it as a thing that was big and far apart, and yet a thing that was always there, and so always together. And this sort of interplay of too far and yet sometimes way too close is kind of uniquely represented in the constellations and the stars and the night sky and the motion of the planets. And I think it's sort of wonderful how many people clearly got that from so many different corners of the Earth.
That is so much bigger a thought than the one I had, which is just everyone saw Scorpio as a scorpion. Okay, this is why I am the scientist. I'm also terrified of scorpions, and so I was like, hey, everyone else must have this thing where they see scorpions easier than they should. Pareidolia of scorpions for the win. Moiya, what things have stood out in history to you?
Yeah, to me, it's the idea that I see so many different people talking about the cyclical nature of the universe, and of life. So you see this in Norse mythology, where Ragnarok, a lot of people think of it as the end of the world, but really it's just the end of our world, and there's another one that comes after it. You see this in Hindu mythology, where there's a god of creation and a god of maintenance and a god of destruction. And after they all get their turn, the whole thing starts over again. So I really love this because it is reflected in things that we see out in the universe, like the life cycle of stars, where stars are born and they create metals and they die, and then their creation, their metals, go out and seed the next generation of stars. We see this in the human life cycle, where we die, we decompose, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and then the cycle of life starts over again with people being born. So I think that because the life cycle is something every human has experienced, we projected that onto our idea of how the universe works. And so many people have done that. I think that's really cool.
We're so primed to see cycles in nature because we experience them with the moon and the sun and the days and weeks and months. I often wonder, like, what would our view on the universe be if we had, say, grown up on Venus, where we couldn't see the sky? There wouldn't have been months, there wouldn't have been years, because it's just opaqueness above you. So much of society for so long has been built around this idea of things being cyclical. And yet, that stems from the fact that we can see out. And if we couldn't see out, almost everything about our mythology would be different. And the way we look at and do science would be different. And you just wonder, how much it's even possible to divorce the circumstances of humanity from the way in which we perceive and engage with the rest of the universe.
Oh, it's impossible. Yeah, they're connected, and you can't take them apart. I've done this world building exercise where I imagine, how would people keep time on a world where you don't have a star, or on a world like Venus where you can't see space. There are a lot of different ways. You could do it by tides if you still have a moon. You could do it by other natural cycles if you pay attention to the reproduction cycles of other animals nearby. You could do it with plants, or even volcanoes, right? Like, I can imagine a scenario where a volcano erupts regularly because of some internal mechanism that's happening that the people on the surface can't see, but they can see the consequences of it. Those are my thoughts.
So time is one of those things that every society has tried, prior to mechanical clocks coming into being, has tried to find a better way to record. Our planet doesn't orbit the sun in an integer number of days. The moon doesn't orbit the Earth in an integer number of days. Everything is a little bit frustrating. And so we've ended up with this truly bizarre system that ultimately is based on orbiting the sun, because harvest. But at first thought, there's no obvious reason to a modern person for why we have 7 days. But there were things more easily visible in the sky 100 years ago. Where does this 7 days come from? Moiya, I think you're the only one that knows this. I see a look of...
I don't know. It looked like Morgan wanted to answer.
Oh, no, I was going to say, oh no.
Got it. Yeah, so we have 7 days because in the times before we had telescopes and we were just looking out at the universe with our unaided eyes, also before light pollution was a thing and we could see more objects, there were 7 wandering objects in the sky. So as the Earth turns, stars that are really far away, they appear to move, but even in ancient mythology, those stars were assumed to be fixed in place, and that they only looked like they moved because the Earth was rotating, or they were moving around the still Earth. But there are 7 objects in the sky that will move even in front of those fixed stars in the background, and those are the sun and the moon, and then the 5 planets that you can see with your unaided eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn.
Saturn.
I can count. I can count. And so those were the wandering stars, or the planets as we know them today, that ancient peoples could see. And based on their appearance and based on their motion across the sky, which is in some ways almost like their behavior, they took their gods. The Romans took their gods and they assigned them to the wandering stars in the sky. And then when the calendar was being made, this is something that humans constructed. We also, back when astrology was more of a practical thing, they took each of those wandering objects and assigned them a day of the week. So Monday, the moon; Sunday, the sun; Saturday, Saturn's day, things like that.
And it's our determination to not just find understanding, but to label things. Humans love to label things. We love to put things in boxes. That has gotten us to the kind of time system we have today. What other ways does the lore and mythology find to creep its way into our everyday lives, in our culture or others? I know the moon in many nations still plays an important role, where there are still modern nations that eschew the necessity of timekeeping by a computer to instead rely on actual observations of our sky. Does anyone want to dive into this or any other related topic?
Tricky
Morgan?
one.
That is a tricky one.
Yeah, I was just thinking of New Year's, and we all have, almost everywhere in the world, the modern world today, we have New Year's celebration, whether that's New Year's by the Western calendar or lunar New Year's. But it's one of these things that there's really no inherent purpose to, celebrating the fact that another unit of time has passed. Most of us don't celebrate the end of another month. But we've all sort of coalesced around this idea of celebrating another year. And again, I think you're right, Pamela. It's related to our just want to label things. And, we all want 2020 to be over and to have a fresh start in 2021. But we can only do that if we can label that thing that is 2020 and say, okay, that's done now. We're doing different now. And so we've sort of, for our own psychological sanity, we have created these sort of checkpoints in time that allow us to unburden ourselves. At Friday at 5 o'clock, I can go open a beer and say, okay, I'm glad that week is done. And on January 1st at 12:01 p.m. or a.m., I can imagine that, okay, it's a whole new year and anything is possible, when on, December 29th, it felt like, oh my God, everything is terrible. And so I think it ties into this deep-seated need to move on. And yet we don't want it to feel random. We don't want to just say, okay, it's Tuesday afternoon, I'm done with this. We want there to be some reason we can move on. And the stars, the moon, the sun, they give us like permission, as fake as we might know it is today, to say, well, okay, now is a time that I'm being told it's time to do something different.
And one of the cool things that I've seen in the past is, with the Mayan calendar, they invested not just in the motions in the sky, but also in biology, where they tied in pregnancy and the menstrual cycle into the counting of all the possible cycles. And as I try and imagine, if you had no star in the sky, how would you count a year? I have to wonder if biology starts to play more and more of a role in your world, and if we have given ourselves a more celestial and physical perspective simply because we have that gateway. And if that's changed us, Moya, do you have any thoughts on how importance comes with what is before our eyes?
Absolutely. It does. I don't know if I have any thoughts beyond that. Um, we have this circadian rhythm of between 24 and 25 hours. That's the cycle that we use to sleep and stay awake and get hungry. There are other, we think of circadian rhythm as just sleep, but it also has to do with hormone levels and how hungry you get and the amount of energy you have. I think that circadian rhythm is tied to the sun, is tied to the length of the day. I don't think the menstrual cycle is actually tied to the lunar cycle. I think that's a coincidence, a happy coincidence that we can use to keep track of time if we, for some reason, lost the moon. And I think that's really important because people think of space. I think these days a lot of people think of space as a static thing. The way space is now is the way it's always been and the way it's always going to be. All of the orbits are going to stay the same. They're going to, stay the same distance away from each other. But space is changing all the time. And so the way we have to use space to our advantage changes all the time. The moon is getting further away from us. Eventually, it's going to be so far away that it doesn't cause a solar eclipse anymore. I think that's what's happening in our solar system, but you can imagine another solar system, another planet out there where the atmosphere is getting thicker and cloudier, like Venus, where eventually you won't be able to rely on space in the same way you have. And so in that way you can make other things, you can invent technologies, you can invent more processes that rely on biology, yours or that of other animals. I don't know if that answered your question, but I think that there are lots of ways.
We can see instances in the past where we've relied on other biology to keep time. If you're a hunter-gatherer tribe that's following the yearly migrations of a herd of game animals, that to them was a lot more important than what was happening in the sun or happening in the moon. Or if you were an early agricultural settlement and you relied heavily on your ability to plant, and that planting could happen only during a very narrow period of time when the conditions were right. Well, that cycle, which would change year to year based on the moisture in the air and whether it's a drought or not, is this an El Nino or La Nina year, that cycle, and people tracked things like El Nino far before they could understand the physics behind why they happen, because they knew that every sixth year or whatever was going to be a hard year for planting, and that your society had to be prepared for that. And that was more important than knowing that, every 60th cycle of the moon was going to be the case, because not always did it line up exactly with something like a lunar cycle. So humans are inventive and resourceful creatures. And, when we've needed to, we've identified the cycle that's most important to our society and fixated on that. And it just happens that now that we've abstracted all of that away to be computerized, mechanized, that we don't really rely on any cycle for that sort of daily survival, that people are fixating on new things. How many people sat down and got excited about the event to unveil the new iPhone a couple of weeks ago, right? That's not critical to our, existence on planet Earth. But for some people, that was like a touchstone. Every September, this thing is going to happen. And so we've kind of latched onto these things that feel important to us, even if now we've kind of made remote all of the cycles that are actually necessary for sustaining us.
If we were to rewrite our world's lore based on what we have today for a sky, for values, our cell phones, what difference do you think we'd have in how we perceive our reality and incorporate it into our culture?
I think we'd be less connected by place. One of the things you can see as recognitions from ancient people that traveled at any length was that you could see the same stars from all of these different places. And now that we can effectively not see stars from most places, that has severed one of these connections between our different places. And we might instead latch on to more material things that were constructed out of our culture as things that connected us more firmly, because we've lost that bigger picture underneath the lights of our cities.
Moiya, what are your thoughts?
I agree with that idea of being less connected. I also think that there might be some sense of hopelessness, or the sense that someone else may have abandoned us. A lot of cultures throughout time and throughout the world have looked at stars and seen them as gods, or as objects placed there by gods, or as the souls of lost loved ones. And the fact that we have more trouble seeing the stars now, and the fact that I can't even identify different stars in the sky, and I'm a freaking astronomer. I mean, the fact that we've lost this knowledge and this connection, I think, could be interpreted as someone more powerful, someone out there turning their backs on us and deciding we're not worth their attention anymore.
Yeah.
Which would definitely yield a darker society.
So we have 2 minutes before we go to Mines on the 49s, and so let's try and end this in something a little bit more uplifting. What is the happiest little thing that you've seen in the sky to find a happy story, or that has just made you want to write a happy story? So, share something positive, Moiya. Give me hope.
Yeah, I love the different things that people have seen in the moon. The man on the moon being made of cheese, the bunny on the moon makes me particularly happy. I love that people take this weird human thing of seeing shapes and faces everywhere we look and applied it to the moon and give us cute little stories that we can tell youngsters. That makes me happy.
Awesome. Morgan, what's your favorite?
I love the fact that we've extended humanity up into the stars with things like the space station. You can get an app on your phone now that tells you when the space station's coming over. There's an entirely uniquely human cycle that we've put into the sky. You see people taking those pictures of the space station passing in front of the moon, and everyone is just wowed that, wow, look at that. There's a picture of the night sky with people in it. And we've taken the stories that used to be for the gods or for mythological people, and we've put the people we know into the sky. And that's just such a wonderful thing.
That is awesome. Thank you both so much for being here for this past hour. Where can people find you? Go quickly. We have 1 minute.
This was a lot.
You can find me on Twitter at GoAstroMo.
Morgan?
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. You can check out my website, morganrehnberg.com.
This is amazing. I can't wait for all the times I get to work with the two of you again. You're doing amazing things. Keep doing it. And all of you out in the audience, thank you for everything you do. We will be back after Minds on the 49s to talk Venus with Dr. Phil Plait and Patricia Craig, but now we're going to click on over to Pixel Riffs, who is going to take us on a tour of what's up in Minecraft. So let's go. Hello. I think I am probably muted to him. Hello, Pixel Riffs. How are things going in world?
Hello, greetings from a very rainy United Kingdom. Luckily, it is a lot sunnier here on the Minecraft server. And what a wonderful conversation, by the way. What a great bridge, I think, from world building to what we are literally doing here in Minecraft, world building. Here we are at the Overworld Welcome Center, which has been worked on by the wonderful Ms. Britkitten and is looking pretty good these days. I think a few people have been planting flowers over here. I was helping out landscaping the place a little bit over on this side, and some other really exciting things have been popping up around the outside. We have some sort of launch pad over here with a lot of launching apparatus going on over here. I think somebody started on a lunar lander over there in the distance. It's a work in progress right now. This wonderful telescope building up here on the hill, and that's being worked on by one of the CosmoQuest staff members, I believe. A lovely obsidian telescope in there, or is it Blackstone? I think that's Blackstone. It's got to be nice and dark anyway to get pictures of deep space. We have a space shuttle here. I'm not sure exactly who is working on this, but it looks absolutely fantastic since I last saw it. They've even got the landing gear sorted out down there with the little wheels. That's a really great touch. And over here, I think this is the one Dr. Pamela's colleague Nick was working on. This is the kind of Waist Deep Cat is saying they built the space shuttle. Well, great stuff. And this is the library with all those Greek columns that is going to be housing lots of knowledge, I'm sure. Well, we're going to head over to the Welcome Center, because over here, if you're interested in joining the server, I'm certain that people will be putting links to the sign up process in the chat. When you come to the Overworld Welcome Center, there are a couple of rooms off to the side here where you can read a little bit about the project. You can come through here and just right click on any one of these lecterns, scroll back to page 1, and it will tell you all about the project. And through here, if you're not too familiar with Minecraft, there is a little bit of a how-to guide to how to play Minecraft if you're unfamiliar with the controls. And through the through the back window, we can see the police box that's out there, of course, as a tribute to our dear friend Paranor. So over here, there's a donate link on a sign as well. Yes, they're very important. Memorize this link, folks. You're going to need it. So this is a bit of the process of what we've been doing over the last few hours. The stream has been going for nearly 6 hours, and we have been very busy because there are a lot of people currently working on effectively just Minecraft scale builds of the planetary bodies in our solar system and a few other Easter eggs besides. And these have all been generated using mods or commands which have enabled us to build spheres very, very quickly. Because, as you know, if you've played Minecraft, building anything that's a shape this complex is pretty hard. So we're going to hop through to the center of the sun, which is not something you get to say very often. I love playing this game and saying stuff like that. This right here is the sun's center. And as the distance sort of renders out in the background, you can get a feel for the scale we are working with here. The sun is to scale along with everything else that's in the solar system. And oh my goodness, it is nice and bright in here. It certainly feels like you're standing in the sun. And it's got a really nice bright set of textures here as well. But of course, yes, this is just far too large for us to render with the scale of a standard Minecraft world. The build height limit in Minecraft only goes up to about 256 blocks. And with the scale that we're working with, if the sun was 256 blocks, most of the other planets would be a block or two. So I think in order to preserve the amount of detail we wanted to get into the planets and preserve some of the balance, the sun is not nearly as large as it could be, potentially. But from here, in this central kind of quartz plaza that we have here, you can teleport yourself out to each of the planets or back to the Earth Welcome Center. Let's go and take a look at Mercury, which was in progress last time I saw it. It looks like it is still in progress, and the builders are coming through, replacing each one of these glass blocks here with the blocks of a build palette, which is just kind of an advice kind of style guide for now. If a builder is feeling creative, they can branch out a little bit from the blocks that have been given here, but this seemed like an appropriate kind of color palette for Mercury, which is obviously has been observed to be largely made of gray rocks. So we have a bunch of basalt and dead coral here, and a little bit of netherrack worked in just to give a nice kind of colorful feel to something that could otherwise be a little bit plain. And whoever's working on this is doing a fantastic job of texturing it. So absolutely keep it up. Let's move on to Venus. Each time you want to return to this central staging area in the center of the sun, you can just pop your right click on one of these buttons on the little quartz house that's built on each of these platforms, and you should be teleported straight back there. So Venus is currently being worked on by somebody else from the community. There is glass for the atmosphere there. That's a really nice detail. And then a few different colored blocks all going into it. So we have an ice cap, of course, at the top. It's going to be a feature of some of the other planets you'll see later on as well. And a few different blocks going into the construction of this to make it a nice colorful representation of Venus. And not all of these are going to be 100% accurate to the images you'll see. And personally, I am not somebody who has studied planetary science like many of the other people you'll hear talking on this stream. I'm here as the resident Minecraft expert, quote unquote, I suppose. So I can't really vouch for the accuracy of any of this, but I think it's great that people are expressing their own artistic interpretation of what some of these planets might be like. Here's a planet we're all very familiar with, though. Let's hop over to the Earth, which, as I said, has an ice cap. It's sort of like it's got an ice pack on its head because it's not been feeling too well. But get better soon, Earth, and maybe get some oceans and some landmass while you're at it. We can also go to the Moon from here, which is a completely separate build and does seem to be completely done, as far as I can tell, including, I believe this was highlighted earlier, an Israeli lunar lander with a little sign on that as well. So very cool that they've included that as a detail. Everyone is afraid to try and do Earth. Exactly. Earth is the one we're all too familiar with, so we can easily criticize people. It's the one I know what it looks like, at least, and that is kind of rare among the other planets that we'll be seeing here. So let's go back to the core of the sun and move on to one I am a little bit more familiar with because I was working on this one a little bit earlier. This is Mars, with a palette that Kiri came up with and has been expanded upon by our resident Mars expert, Nick, although I think he was trying to work out a few of his details and found that the scale was a little bit too small for all of the stuff he wanted to do. Everything that was a remarkable feature of Mars probably equates to about the size of one block with the scale that we're working at here. So maybe we can squeeze a couple of those in, or maybe just put a sign marking where they are using text or something like that. But Mars is looking great out here in the void, has a couple of little Easter eggs around the back, which you've seen if you've been following the stream a little bit already. And I do agree with Ambius in the chat. Mars is looking gorgeous. There are a couple of things in here that are still yet to be determined, and I think that is all going to depend on how quickly we get the rest of the planetary bodies done. And most of those have had a fairly reasonable range of progress on them. Let's go somewhere that hasn't had much progress yet, because it is the largest planet in our little collection here. I've actually been working on all of this stuff myself. This is Jupiter, and of course, being the largest planet in our solar system, this is 256 block wide sphere. And if you've built anything in Minecraft, you will know that 256 blocks is quite large. So what we have here is at least a start on the Great Red Spot, which is, of course, one of the most iconic features of Jupiter. It's the first thing I gravitated to when I decided to come over here and take on this project. And I hope that people will come and join me in building a little bit more of Jupiter, because for a start, I don't know what the back or the sides look like. So I'm hoping that some more learned people than me will be able to fill some of that stuff in, or at least kind of give us some artistic interpretation of that. But in the meantime, yeah, working on some of the details, and a lot more color goes into Jupiter, because there are just some incredibly colorful and detailed pictures of Jupiter we have that can really inform how all of the swirling gases in the atmosphere are going to look. Moving right along, I'm pretty sure these are going to be set up to go to the moons of Jupiter, but I'm not certain how many of those are going to be out there, and the command blocks are probably not yet in place. So let's pop back through to the sun, and this is the one I'm really excited about because people have been working really hard on this. We're going to go to Saturn, and the major feature of Saturn, of course, is going to be the rings, which are being worked on out here with a variety of materials. It looks like they've been lighting up some of these areas as well, just so the rings have a nice, healthy glow to them, and you can get a sense of the scale if I come back here a little bit and you can see the sphere and you can see the radius of the rings and the amount of work that the community is going to be doing putting all of this into effect. It's going to be a monolithic project, but I cannot wait to see how it turns out. We've certainly got a lot more time to work on it. This is the progress that's been made over the last 6 hours, and there are 30 more hours to go. So I'm certain that people will be able to do a lot of work on this. Maybe a few people will be able to get home from work or wherever they have to be and contribute to the project, but it's going to look fantastic. From here, I think we can go to Titan, which one member of the community was very excited about and had a bit of an idea for already. We've got the base there with some atmosphere around the outside, and they've even marked out what exactly each block is meant to represent, which is super cool. I'll pop back through to the other planets real quick. I think I'm hearing that Dr. Pamela is back from a break, so hello. If you're in the chat, welcome back. Looks like we haven't had much progress left on Uranus as of yet. Moving on to Neptune and Pluto, I expect will probably be in the same sort of state. Yes, just template spheres for those right now. Some big glass spheres that people can come along and add to.
This is absolutely amazing to watch, Pixel Riffs, and I'm so glad that you're part of us doing this amazing build. This is in honor of one of our shared community members and the greatest mod, Paranor 001. It was his idea
Absolutely.
to bring us together, and
Yes. And I'm very glad that he did, because yeah, this has been a really fun project to work on. It's given me a nice break from the stuff that I normally do and some pretty large stuff. I'm standing here looking at Pluto and wishing I'd taken on Pluto instead of Jupiter, but I think it's coming together really well, and I cannot wait to see where the rest of our wonderful builders take the rest of these projects. I think we have some friends of mine coming in from the 8-bit community with the hot dish. And hopefully some of them will make short work of some of these leftover planets.
I'm loving watching where you're going hour by hour, and we will see where we are at 449 when we bring everyone minds on the 49s. But for now, I'm going to click on over to our new guests are here, and we're going to talk about Venus. So thank you once again, Pixel Riffs, and happy building.
It's a pleasure. I'll be back soon.